It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I am so glad that we have this time together. I'm Sanaa Laybourne. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. According to the US Census, the United States is home to more than 45 million immigrants, or about 14% of the total US population. And while this country's origin story is one of immigration, there have almost always been anti immigration attitudes, deep misconceptions about the immigration process, and biases about who is worthy of belonging. For example, although asylum seeking is legally permissible, asylum seekers are often framed as unworthy, criminal, and undeserving of U.S. protections. While mainstream news media and politicians often talk about immigration in terms of borders and safety, what's missing in these conversations are the historical, political, and social contexts that lead people to leave their home countries, their families, and what's familiar and seek refuge in another country. In Rivermouth, a chronicle of language, faith, and migration, Alejandra Oliva provides a personal account of immigration through her experience interpreting at the US-Mexico border, at an asylum application clinic, and at an ICE incarceration center during a site visit. Alejandra Oliva is an essayist, embroiderer, and translator. Her writing has been included in Best American Travel Writing, nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and was honored with an Aspen Summer Words Emerging Writers Fellowship. Her book, Rivermouth, A Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration, which we'll be talking about today, received a Whiting Nonfiction Grant. She holds a master's degree from Harvard's Divinity School, and Alejandra joins us today. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I am so excited to be chatting about your book. I'm very much interested in our immigration process, on the ways that we don't understand our immigration process at all, yet all of us seem to have very strong attitudes and opinions about how it's working or not working, or what people should be doing. And so when I saw your book, I said, wow, okay, I have to read this book, first of all. And I have to hopefully have you on the show so we can talk more about it. And here you are. So I'm excited.
I'm really excited too. And it felt as I was writing sometimes that I was like doing equal portions of like sharing my own experiences and also like trying to do education and like actually this is what this term means that you've heard a lot but maybe like don't have the context for the knowledge of. And so hopefully that's something that worked.
Absolutely. And that's what one thing that I was going to say that I really loved about this book is, of course, you're sharing your personal experiences, but you're also contextualizing both your own personal experience and the broader kind of immigration process into its own history and into the particular social and political conditions that have shaped the immigration process here in the US. And so I learned so much. Like so many, I don't even know where to start. I learned so much, or I'm like, different things are popping in my mind right now. And I'm like, wow, I had no idea. Like the immediate thing that came to mind was about the bananas. And like this, it is bananas.
It's super
uh,
bananas, yes.
and since now we're talking about it, maybe we can let the folks who are listening in know a little bit more too. And maybe we'll just start there because I think it's so instructive for how little we know about immigration and why people are really forced to seek refuge and do so here.
Yeah, so we can start with the United Fruit Company. This is this company that was US owned, and basically they went down into Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and started buying up land to set up banana plantations. And if you think of like those kitschy, weird, like 1950s recipes where you had like bananas floating in jello and like all of this crazy stuff and like bananas on cornflakes. Like this is all this sort of like manufacturing of a market for this fruit. And the thing is, as they're buying up all this land, as they are sort of going into these countries and rearranging their agricultural system, Bananas are also kind of like a finicky plant in that they are all clones of one another. So if one plant gets a disease, then all the other plants around it are susceptible to it. And so you have all these situations where like entire plantations or entire parts are like getting taken out by banana diseases. And as some of the governments of these countries are starting to say, wait, hold on, we don't want this one single company to be the landowner of like 90% of our land, and started trying to kick them out, the United Fruit Company started getting their friends and allies in the US government to come in and start destabilizing the governments of these countries, to start manufacturing coups to replace the people who were in power. And just in this way, completely destabilized the entire region of Central America, parts of South America. And it's kind of from these very early stabilizations, like around the late 1800s and early 1900s, that we see so much of the beginnings of these political problems that have continued on in these countries to the present day, because of the ways that, you know, the wealthy were empowered, or a select few people were empowered. And I'm trying to remember, I read a fantastic book about this to do the research for that section. It's called Bananas. I'm trying to see if I can find the name of the guy who wrote it, because it's a really like top to bottom incredible book. Oh, by Peter Chapman. Bananas, How the United Fruit Company Shaped the World. I would really recommend that book. It's fantastic.
Yes. I mean, I know bananas might seem like a weird place to start this conversation, but I think, again, and just thank you so much for sharing that. It really, I think, frames out what we're talking about, right? It's not just immigration that's happening today because of necessarily something that is happening in our present moment, but we're talking about immigration and the flow of people and the flow of power that is centuries, right, in the making. But yet I always like to say, you know, the past is ever present, and it's shaping our experience and how we understand the world today. And I think this is also just a great example of how you're able to bring in really important historical, social, political knowledge into your book in a way that makes sense, right? And that helps us have a fuller understanding, again, of things that are happening today. But then also, you know, hopefully gets people interested to learn more and maybe go read more about bananas, to have a fuller understanding of this moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that it's very easy to just see sort of the very thing that's happening right now and say, you know, I can see the reasons that this is happening, and it all lies outside of our borders. This is none of our business. Why should we be getting involved? And then you look at something like the United Fruit Company and you're like, no, wait, it's because of our involvement as a government in these other countries and these other places, so that we could exploit their resources, so that we could you know, take as much money and goods out of those countries, that those countries are in trouble now today. And so it is our business. We made it our business when we went down there initially.
Yes, we can't mind our own business. And so, or maybe it is that we think everything is our business. And now, and now here we are in this moment. I think the other piece that really stuck out to me, and that I like to I'm thinking about in the classroom, remind my students about as we talk about immigration in the classes that I teach, is that asylum seeking is a legally permissible. It is the quote unquote right way to immigrate, or one of the quote unquote right ways to immigrate. I know there's a lot of language and inflammatory language around doing it the quote unquote right way. And asylum seeking is one of those ways. And yet we have very much demonized asylum seeking as a type of immigration, not to speak anything of the folks who are asylum seekers. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more just about kind of the history of asylum as a type of immigration process, and even a little bit about the process itself.
Yeah, so asylum seeking, or like asylum as a legal political category, started out as something that happened in the wake of World War II, as we sort of as a global community were realizing the ways in which we had profoundly failed Jewish people living in Europe. And, there are all kinds of stories about the United States turning people away because they had already fulfilled their quota for like the number of German or Dutch or whatever immigrants that year. There are all kinds of stories in which like we were not able to help as many people as we should have because of our adherence to our very like strict at that point numbers-based immigration system. And so as a national community, we kind of came, or an international community, I should say, we kind of came together with all these other countries and said, people have the right to seek asylum if they are being persecuted by their government for a quality that they are unable to change or that they shouldn't have to change. So things like your religion, you shouldn't be forced to convert, but you could, or like your race, which you can't change. And so it was saying, if your government is persecuting you for these things, you should have the ability to move to a different country and ask for asylum, ask for the right to stay there legally, build a life there, and not have to return to your own country because you're afraid of being harmed if you go home. And this is, I think, it took us a long time for everybody to sign on, and it's an incredibly important piece of sort of like international agreement. But what's happened in the last couple of years is not just that the people who are coming here to the US are afraid of going back home, but they're afraid for going back home for a number of different reasons that aren't necessarily related to like government persecution in the way that we had originally planned for it. And like, for example, fleeing from war isn't necessarily a thing that will get you asylum. Having to flee because your home has been destroyed by a natural disaster time and time again because of increased global warming is not a reason to apply for asylum. And so we're seeing a world that is much more complicated and much more challenging than the one that our asylum laws set up, almost 100 years ago now, sort of were meant to capture. But we still have all these people showing up who need help and who are often being persecuted for what you could consider a political opinion. Not wanting to join a gang in El Salvador is a political opinion. You have this like political stance that you shouldn't have to do that. And the government is not helping you in not doing that. And so maybe you need asylum. And so we have all these people showing up saying, asylum is, I want asylum. I'm afraid to go back to my home country. And that's kind of what I talk about in the book when I talk about credible fear interviews. That's this very first step that you take where, an asylum officer says, are you afraid to go back to your home country? Why? And you have to say yes. And you have to kind of explain the things that have happened to you or the things that have happened to your family that make that fear real or quote unquote credible. What that often looks like is an extremely traumatized person sitting in front of a government official and saying, I'm scared because of this, this, and this. And a credible fear interview, passing a credible fear interview alone will not get you asylum. You still have to appear either in front of a court or in front of another asylum official with like your proof and everything. But that credible fear interview is kind of this very, very first step where you don't necessarily have to have, the text messages this person sent you or know a ton about like your country conditions that mean that this is a thing that's happening to you. It's just meant to sort of pass this very, very baseline level of proof. And that will hopefully, depending on what kind of policies are going on at the border, get you into the country, let you start building your case to apply for asylum, let you start sort of finding family to settle with or finding a place to live, things like that. And then you still have to apply for asylum and go through that first step. But if you don't pass your credible fear interview, if you are unable to convince that official, then you immediately get deported or expelled from the country. And so it's this really, really high pressure situation where people are having to construct a narrative out of something that may have happened very recently, out of something that they may not fully, when you're traumatized, your like sense of time and your sense of narrative get really scrambled. And so you may not be able to like string a full coherent, first this happened, then this happened, then this happened together. And so it's this really, really high stress, high stakes moment. And we don't have people with attorneys in the room. Sometimes your translator is like on speakerphone on a phone in the middle of the table. And so you're kind of like, what's he saying? I don't understand. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's these really, really high stakes moments that are also treated very sort of casually and sort of not importantly. But yeah.
Yeah. You know, as I was reading your book and you're talking about the credible fear interview, and it was bringing to mind another guest that we had on this show, Dina Nayiri. Her book is Who Gets Believed. And so again, in part of her book, she is talking about asylum seeking and this process of constructing a believable story, a story that will move someone to say, okay, you know, you have a credible fear and will allow you to stay in this country, right? As you go through that formal process. But again, this question of how does a person construct the right narrative? And when we think about translation, and that plays a big role in it, as you talk about in your book, right? Finding the right words and what gets lost in translation and how much of yourself ends up in, you know, in that translation. And just that idea of how much language can move us or not move us if we can't translate in a way that also can convince somebody of what we've experienced, or even translate or convey the right emotion.
Yeah, exactly. And so you are, relying on someone that you often haven't met. You can't really check their work because you don't understand this other language that they're speaking. And it just feels really scary. Like I said, sometimes they're not even physically present in the room. And so it's this also other layer of like, it's someone I can't see, it's someone I don't know, it's someone who I think might be understanding me, but I can't confirm that in any way. And so it's
Yeah.
this really tense, fraught relationship and situation.
Mm-hmm. I was doing a little bit of research because, again, we have so many misconceptions and just misunderstandings about the immigration process. And if we believe what we hear politicians or political pundits saying, our sense of what's happening is even more warped. But I found this data from the Migration Policy Institute about asylum backlogs. And it says more than 1.3 million asylum applications were awaiting processing as of May 2023. Of these, approximately 750,000 were pending in immigration courts. So about 40% of all cases in the immigration court system. 600,000 were with US Citizenship and Immigration Services. And the average asylum case in immigration court takes more than 4 years to be completed. And that I had no idea. But that is a long time to be in limbo, in fear of potentially being returned to a place that you can't, like you won't be safe, but also unsure of, where you are, like in that limbo position. You can't really put down roots where you are either.
Yeah, no, the asylum backlog, and honestly, like most immigration categories have a crazy, crazy backlog like that one too, of not just months, but years of waiting for your case to be pulled through. And that's also the kind of thing that has repercussions all the way down the line. So it's incredibly difficult right now to find an attorney who will accept your asylum case because everyone's got these cases that they're holding on to for 4 years. And just because a case is waiting for a date to come for their court date or for the next step to happen doesn't necessarily mean that there's not active work going on. Like it could be that, the client moves and so you have to file a change of venue, or you realize that you need to file a continuance, or you have to like renew the paper. Like there's all kinds of like little things. And so for these cases to take 4 years, it means that there's like constant ongoing work. And so every asylum attorney that I know has a crazy caseload and
Yeah.
just cannot take on new cases, but it takes a really long time for any single case to get cleared. And so it's also really difficult to find representation, and it's much, much harder to win your case if you don't have representation, because that
Mm-hmm.
asylum application is complicated and it is weird to fill out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your book so much for really kind of walking us through these complexities and the challenges. Again, because I think people think like, oh, it's just this fast process, right? You get in quote unquote the line and then you fill out your paperwork and then
Yeah.
you're here. And it's like, that's not how that works at all. But when I think about storytelling, right, which of course is what you're talking a lot about in your book, I was thinking about the types of immigration stories, right, that we're used to, both that immigration success story, which we love, right? As Americans that bootstrap, that, like came from nothing and now
Yeah.
look. We love that story. So there's that type of way to be an immigrant, right? But then also the immigration horror stories, which I think, really toe the line of like a immigration trauma porn, right? That's like the only kind of two ways that we think about immigrants, or that success or just so tragic. And what your book does so beautifully is really demonstrate the complexities in the immigration process, and more than just like oversimplified, oh, people cross a border, right?
Yeah.
But the actual individual experiences of immigration, which are very, very varied, right? They're different, they're individual. And I think we have to put the people back into the immigration process for us to really understand and start to grow our sense of community, I think, but also humanity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, when, as you kind of mentioned in the intro to the show, when we talk about immigration, we're often talking numbers, we're talking policy. And when we talk numbers, we're talking like, X thousand number of people across the border this month or whatever. But there's very little focus on everyday people's stories and kind of like, oh, I'm here, or like, this is what I had to get through to get across the border. And we have some of that now, but it's not, about the little details that happen along the way, or it's not about people's like reality and lived experience. And we have some really beautiful books that address this, like from the point of view of people. I'm thinking of Marcelo Hernandez Castillo's The Children of the Land, which is sort of his memoir about being a kid and undocumented. And then this book that's been huge in the last couple of years, Javier Zamora's Solito, which is about his experiences being an unaccompanied child migrant as he crosses the border. And so in these books, in a bunch of other like narratives and first person things that are just like coming out of the shadows in these last couple of years, we have people claiming these experiences and talking about what it's been like for them. And I feel like there's an increased awareness of people's humanity, but at the same time, like when you're listening to the news, it's still just like these numbers, these sort of images of like floods of people rather than individual human beings. And I think that it's remembering that, there's each of these individual people and these stories that we hear. That's everyone. That's not just the ones that end up writing a book. It's everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, as I was reading your book, something that I continue to really appreciate, but also help me kind of think through even, how I think about immigration, being an immigrant myself, is the way that you let us into your own thought process and how you're wrestling with your own beliefs, right? And of course, that's where I think part of that faith part comes in. And what I love was how you talk about, you know, your decision to translate, why, and this idea of being a good person, right? That translation might offer up something good to someone else. And even a lot of, you talk about like feelings of grief as well for some of the things that you experience firsthand as a translator at the border. And so in this book, it is personal. And I think what helps me as a reader is to understand, again, like your own thought process and your own experience in some of the encounters that you have.
Yeah, it felt really important to me to kind of talk about who I was as I was going through this process, because I think that, I mean, it's inescapable. Like I am who I am, and I'm the person that I was while I was writing the book, and I was the person that I was as I was going through all these things. And I think, as you mentioned, like a lot of people don't know much about the immigration system. And that certainly applied to me when I started working in it. I was just kind of like, I don't think I even really knew what asylum was when I started doing the interpretation work. Like, it was a new concept for me and something that I was figuring out sort of as I was working. And, you know, every single step of the way, like, taught me something new. And it felt really important to bring people along to that, because I think it's also one of those areas that people are like, oh, I should know about this. This is like a big deal. It's in the news all the time. Why don't I understand it? And it felt very important to be like, no, you're allowed to be like very misinformed and stupid about this. I was. And, you know, come with me as I learn about this in real time.
Yeah.
And so that felt really important. And then the other thing that I really, really wanted to get across by like including myself in the book was, you know, I'm the child of immigrants, but it was a very different immigration story than the one that we tell a lot, or that we were kind of seeing in that I was like meeting people with. So my parents came to the country for my dad to finish his PhD. And so they came into the country with an amount of wealth, an amount of like social and cultural capital, an amount of like educational privilege that is not what we usually hear when we think about immigration, or it's not what we usually think about. And so by the time I was born, by the time I got both of my languages, my parents were very well established in the US. Having papers was never a question. It was always sort of a thing that happened because they were the kinds of immigrants that the US quote unquote wanted and felt to be valuable. And so because of all of these things, it felt really important to say, you know, there is a sense in which I understand and can empathize with what people are going through or with the stories that I'm hearing. But there is another way in which I have no idea. My family's financial privilege, my family's social privilege has absolutely kept me from many, many of these realities. And I am figuring them out also as I go. And so it felt really important to also be able to say, you know, I am part of this conversation, I'm part of this story, but there are limits to what I know and understand and the conversations that I can be a part of or contribute to. But it still felt important to go and express my solidarity and to go and be involved in this work. And like, it was also complicated. It was like, I want to be a good person, but like, what does that actually look like? And what does that mean? And to what extent are you complicit in the system when you are even like helping somebody fill out a form that's going to make them findable to the US government in a lot of ways? And these are all feelings and complications and complexities that I felt like I had in the middle of doing the work, and also after, that I still think about a lot. And so that was something that I wanted to include in the book, because I wanted to show that it wasn't just this straightforward being like, hello, I'm here to do good works. I'm here to help. And like, it's much more complicated than that. And I think it's much more complicated than that whenever you spin to a situation as complicated as, you know, the US immigration system, the border. And it does nobody any favors to pretend like it's a simple thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what I loved about the book, was you being so honest about like, it's complicated. I had these different feelings. My beliefs were challenged. I changed my mind about things. And I really appreciated that as a reader. You mentioned like writing this as a way, like, come with me as I learn about this very complex system that is always changing. That's the thing. Like, what you knew at the time that you were doing the work, at the time that you were writing the book, very different than even today, and what those laws and policies might look like. And that's part of the reason why it's so complicated, is because our policies are always around immigration are always changing. And so it's hard to really get a firm understanding of even what the process is or what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. I finished the like very last editable version of this book about a month before Biden released his immigration policies at the beginning of this year. And so there's like kind of some hints that like in the book that like the Biden administration is not doing as well as I wanted them to as far as immigration policies, but like the real stuff wouldn't come until just after my deadline. And so it's like, even now the book is outdated and it's going to keep being outdated forever. But it still feels important to be, especially during the Trump years where everything was changing so quickly. I was like very conscious of being like, this happened in these months, because this may not have been the case if you went down to Tijuana 6 months later, even a week later. In my case, I went right before the migrant protection protocols were established, which basically meant you could cross the border, get an asylum hearing date, and then be kicked right back out to Mexico to wait for that time, which, as you mentioned, could be months or years before you got your actual court date. And so all those people that I saw crossing the border would have come right back the next week. And so even a week after I was seeing what I saw, the situation changed again completely. And so it felt important to record what was happening, because even every time a policy changes, there are still people who get caught up in it and whose lives are changed by these very, very seemingly minor choices. And it's important to recognize that, like, people's lives have been actually affected by all this tug of war and, like, switching between policies and changing things from 1 month and 1 week to another. And so, yeah, it's an outdated book, but I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is okay, because it just shows how much of our immigration policy is very much at the whims of people in power. And that's what I also appreciated about the book, right? You have these broader, kind of more historical context, but then also understanding that in the moment, right, these laws and policies are changing, week to week. And what we thought was maybe a permanent process or a permanent stance from the United States can change, right, at any point in time, depending upon who's elected. Something that really resonated with me as I was reading the book, you talk about January 2017, right, when Trump comes into office and, of course, makes so many different changes,
Yes.
broad stroke changes to immigration policy. And you say you're Googling whether your expired Texas driver's license would be enough to prove your citizenship. And I just remember January 2017, as I'm sure folks who are immigrants remember that time. And I'm a transnational adoptee, but I remember even in adoptee circles, people saying, like, looking for their adoption paperwork, looking for their naturalization paperwork, making sure that they had access to paperwork that, as we also know, paperwork, like, that doesn't really mean it doesn't have to mean anything, but that some sort of sense of security that we're looking for in the midst of all of these really massive changes that are impacting, right, our lived experience.
Yeah, and it was one of those things that, like, even as I was doing it, I was like, I don't actually know if this is a big deal. Like, I think I might be too privileged for this to, like, actually have an effect on me. Like, certainly I've never thought about this before. But even so, there was that fear kind of creeping in of being like, what if it does become a big deal? What if this is suddenly a thing that matters in this huge, huge way, and I have messed up by not ensuring that I have a current driver's license in my wallet? And I mean, that goes to show both the level of privilege that I had, that I'd never thought about it before.
Mm-hmm.
That I could let my driver's license expire, that I could, like, be like, I don't actually know where my passport is. Like, let me call my parents. And also just the level of fear and uncertainty that I think a lot of people who were not white, in some way immigrants, were feeling in those first couple of weeks, where it was suddenly like, wait, we can just ban immigration from, like, a number of countries and just leave people stranded, leave students with visas stuck at the airport. We can just stop, like, that can happen. And so I think a lot of people were suddenly like, wait, what else can happen? In what ways was my life that I thought was very stable and safe, could that be destabilized? And I think that is a very common experience for a lot of other people who live with much more precarious immigration statuses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, like you said, for a lot of folks, we might have the privilege to not have to think about a lot of these questions. I think for me, at the heart of your book, and even in this, kind of one moment of time that we're talking about that you discuss in the book, again, it brings it back to these broader questions of belonging, right? Who gets to belong? Who's deserving of belonging? What does it mean to be a citizen, right? Or what does it mean to be able to even just stay in the country? As well. And you talk a lot about, for me, as I'm reading this idea, right? These bigger ideas of belonging, and how we create that value of people and who we're able to accept in as immigrants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is, even for people who have their statuses, even for people who have like gone through all of this and finally gotten their paperwork, there is still a sense of marginalization, or like a feeling that like I just went through all that and I was treated in this way, and now that I have like this one little piece of paper, suddenly
Mm-hmm.
everything is completely different. And like, what does that mean about this piece of paper? What does that mean about my status as a person? And um that seems like a problem that is both a lot more challenging to fix, and one that is urgent that we do so, and one that seems really important to take on as a country and as a culture.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to change gears just slightly because a lot of the book, you're also talking about where you were in school and thinking about being in divinity school and how that's also framing both the ideas of translation that you kind of talk about a little bit about translation theory, but also how you're thinking through your own ideas of faith. And I found this part really interesting because so many of the things that happen in our world can challenge our faith, right? And then also as a person who grew up in the church, but then was like, oh, I don't really think that's my thing, but then coming back to some ideas, I guess, or some relationship with God or whatever it is, I was also really drawn to your reflections on this idea of faith. And you really weave in some of these Christian Bible stories that folks might be familiar with as well. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts now about, or where's your thinking now about these ideas of faith and this idea of a God who is, all knowing and supposedly working things out for our good. Where have you landed now on these big ideas of faith?
That is a great question, and one that is still really complicated for me,
Yeah.
honestly. Yeah, I was in divinity school for most of the events of the book and also a good chunk of writing of the book. And I went to divinity school because I'd been raised very evangelical, and like you, was kind of like, I don't know about this, I'm not sure, had moved away from it, and had kind of like started realizing all the ways that like it had actually had a tremendous impact on my life too, and like my ways of thinking, my ethics, my everything, to have been part of a church for 18 and change years. And I was like, okay, this feels like it's maybe worth a little bit more investigation or a little more digging into. And I feel like doing divinity school and doing this work at the same time also like led me to confront these very, very old questions of, why does injustice and suffering exist if God is just? And like,
Mm-hmm.
why is any of this happening if theoretically somebody is looking out for us? And I don't know that I've like resolved those questions. And at the same time, there is a tremendous sense of like ethics and responsibility and sort of outreach to other people that I feel like came from doing that work that doesn't feel unrelated to religion. And a lot of people that I met doing that same work were there because of an out of religious conviction. A lot of the migrants that I met and were talking to had incredibly, incredibly strong senses of faith and of a God that was looking out for them, and of being protected and surrounded by God's love in a way that I was like, really? We're going through very hard times, and I don't know about this. And I guess like the way that I feel about it now is that it's really complicated, and that I don't understand all of it, and I don't need to.
Yeah.
I just need to know enough to keep doing the work and to keep showing up and to keep asking questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, such big questions, right? I don't expect you to have it all figured out. But part of the beauty in the book is you wrestling with, with your faith or with some of these ideas, like you said, about justice or injustice, and is there some loving God who really is has control or is doing something good with all this really horrible things that are happening. And I think those are questions that are very human questions that people have, probably regardless of if you're in a faith tradition or not. Why are these things happening, and should they make sense, or is there some good that's gonna come out of it all, or are we just out here just living a life of suffering?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so that really, really struck me, particularly as you're talking about translation, and you talk about a Bible story that folks might be familiar with about the Tower of Babel. And I thought, when you talk about both this as being kind of the creation of different languages, right? So people are trying to build this tower that's going to get them up to God, and God is like, nope, you're not going to get up here. So all of a sudden people are struck with all these different languages, and perhaps they cannot understand each other. And you bring up a big point, because it's not just the language or maybe not being able to communicate in words that people kind of remember or can come to a consensus about, but that was the beginning of this distrust in one another. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit more about both language and how it can create trust, or maybe how it can even sow distrust.
Yeah, so when I was in undergrad, I was really good friends with this girl who could speak three languages very, very fluently. She spoke English and French and Arabic. And I remember going with her to like a Cuban diner, and it was her and another friend. And my other friend and I were speaking Spanish, and we ordered in Spanish. And they turned to my friend and they were like, "What do you want in Spanish?" And she was like, "Oh my God, I don't know. Like, I don't understand." Like, I could just see her like panicking. And I feel like that is this very like illustrative story, because of the way that like when you are confronted with another language that somebody expects you to speak, or that somebody expects you to understand, it can be tremendously disorienting and like kind of freaky, even if you already know three other languages very, very well. And I think that that sort of spark of disorientation and that sort of spark of feeling confused and sort of like anxious about being able to communicate is a seed of a lot of this like distrust or anxiety around people who don't speak your language, or who are unable to communicate with you in the way that you want them to. And at the same time, I feel like even being able to come and speak a couple of words and be like, "Hello," I'm making like a little bit of an effort. I can say hello to you. I can say, "How are you?" And then I can say, "Sorry, my whatever language is not that good." Is a way to sort of start building connection and start building a relationship with someone, even across languages. And there are, at the border, I saw people who would not understand Spanish, or have somebody ask them a question and they would be like, I don't know. Like, I'm going to pull over a translator, and kind of like have that panic reaction. And I also saw people who spoke no Spanish and were able to just, say like, "Hola," and like share stickers, or just kind of be like, "I don't understand what you're saying, but like, I'm here to support you." And like, if you need anything, I will pull someone over. But until now, we can just share this coffee or share this moment in time. And like, yeah, no problem. I can look after your kids for you for a second while you like repack your bags or, and so there are these, it is possible to overcome that initial sort of like moment of spark and moment of panic and just be like, we're both people. We're going to try and get along. We're going to try and communicate. And, you know, that doesn't work for every situation. That doesn't work for every place. But I think just having that openness and that willingness is something that feels, I think, particularly challenging to English monolingual speakers who have never really had to confront that, because I also see, you know, immigrants navigating a world all the time that doesn't necessarily cater to them linguistically and just being like, yeah, yes, I can make myself understood if I need to, or like, I brought my neighbor who speaks English and like, we're here, we're going to figure it out. And so I think that it's important for people who are not used to navigating a multilingual world to get used to it, to not panic, to try their best to feel comfortable, even if that's not your first reaction or your first response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about those moments that we can either embrace or run away from, right? And try to insulate ourselves away from having those moments of maybe disorientation, or we can embrace them, particularly as we are in a country that has no national language. But yet the ways that for a lot of folks, you know, we believe like everyone should be able to speak English, versus thinking like, how are the ways that I might be able to communicate and welcome in folks who maybe I don't understand, but who I could learn to understand, right? Or who we could have those human connections. And I think it's really important. And something that your book does so well is really, I think, challenge folks to think about, how can I make those human connections? How can I be more aware of what's happening to the people around me? And where might I be able to step in, and, you know, hopefully create, you know, a more welcoming community. If not thinking about how might I get involved in the political process, right, to help create a more welcoming community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, there are all kinds of levels of involvement that you can have, from being like, you know, my neighbor speaks this other language, I should learn how to say hello so I can like wave at them over the fence or whatever, to I'm going to call or write my congressman, to I'm going to figure out what kind of organizing around immigration issues is going around in my community and get involved in that, and, you know, make posters and show up at rallies and write letters and all this stuff. And so there are all kinds of ways that you can get involved, and all of those are important and special. And even if your way of getting involved is just making like one person feel like they are a part of your community and that they are somebody that you are looking out for, then that's it. That's the whole project. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that, how in the book you say, this book is about immigration, but it's also about reading and rereading, going over passages in your life, poring over someone else's words until you find your own life irrevocably altered. And I think even, you know, for me, both reading your words and but also thinking back through different moments in my own life as well, and how might I reinterpret those, and what might I do with that information now, right, that maybe is giving me a new perspective. So I think this book is a really great companion to even thinking through, I'll say my life as a reader, and I'm sure for other folks when they read the book as well. I also found it a book that I had to take my time with in a good way, right? A book that I wanted to savor and really understand, because of, again, as we talked about, as we started, you know, all these different historical moments, right? That I'm like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. That made me like really rethink, you know, what I knew about bananas, maybe, or other things. But then also because for me, as someone who does not speak Spanish, and you include text throughout that is in Spanish, I think even for some folks, that in itself, that process of, okay, but I want to know what's being said, and taking that moment to, Google Translate, and then also which then put me in that mindset or that process of like, I don't think this is exactly what they said. Right?
Yeah, Google Translate's getting better, but there are times when you're like, I don't know about this.
Right? I was like, I'm pretty sure that's not what was said, or that's not what was meant, even though maybe these words mean, like these
different things. Yeah.
And so even just like that process of, really understanding, like for me, just as a reader, wanting to understand what you're saying, and then being like, okay, I'm going to have to use more context clues.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the point, right? Like of translation. Things get lost in translation, and we try the best that we can, and we can get better, right? Like we can get better. And we can also, in a lot of ways sometimes, or in a lot of situations, use context clues and kind of figure it out, but find a way to communicate and be understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if the book is arguing for anything or saying anything, it's this sort of like encouragement to do that, and to sort of be open to different ways of communicating, and to be open to different ways of getting in touch with and getting along with your neighbors. And so I'm glad that you took the time to do all these little translations and kind of trying to figure out what I was talking about. So yeah.
Yeah, of course, because I want to understand what's happening with the folks that you mentioned in the book, but also in this process. And I think that same desire to understand others, I think we can use that outside of reading a book, right? We can use that in our daily lives, and understand others, because we also know how important it is for us to be understood, right? And we have that human need to be able to connect with people. I think it's part of what you mentioned in the book too, about like language and how it can signal, of course, like relationships, but also care. And so just taking that opportunity to, again, like you said, maybe even just learn to say hello, how are you? And what that communicates about how we feel about other people that we encounter, and the way that we can care for one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, speaking to someone is like this very basic level of showing them your attention, and of welcoming them into your community and your life. And so being able to do that even at a very basic level with people you meet is a really important first step to building community, and to building solidarity with people who you might see every day but not have talked to before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. As you talk about in the book, of language as being, both individual, but also collective. And again, historically connected, politically constructed, but a shared project that we do together. And so the together part is key, right? We have to actually get together, to actually engage in this process of naming and building community as well. Well, Alejandra, it has been such a pleasure to chat with you about your beautiful, beautiful book. There's so much that we could have talked about, but hopefully the bananas were enough to get people really super interested.
Yes.
But also let people know like that the book is about both personal experiences, but again, those broader social, political, and historical factors as well that are present in all of our lives. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation, and thank you.
Thank you again to Alejandra Oliva. She is the author of Rivermouth, A Chronicle of Language, Faith, and Migration. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book because of the ways that Alejandra is able to weave in both her personal story, her experiences with, in this case, translating in a variety of different contexts, but also, again, really giving us some of that historical, social, and political context as well. I think a lot of times we have these very standard immigration stories in our minds, but she does a beautiful job of giving us insights into the immigration process, but also stories that maybe we're not as familiar with, right? That aren't part of those immigration big narratives that we might see circulated in the media. And even for myself as a transnational adoptee, as an immigrant, our stories are usually not framed as immigration stories, but rather as family stories. So that was also top of mind for me as I was thinking about the ways that we think about immigration or who is an immigrant. And again, all these ideas of deservedness and what does it mean to belong. I actually want to leave today with an excerpt from the book. Alejandra writes, "The task of the archivist translator of anonymous texts is this: to be able to surface from within herself a story that will move people into action, that might change a mind or at least turn it to contemplation, to elide the boundaries so I'm not the only one carrying it." This book definitely has changed my mind or opened my mind to different ways to think about immigration, but also just helped me to understand that immigration process a little bit more. Again, immigration always in our news cycle, yet we know very little about the immigration process, and sometimes that is on purpose. But this book really sheds light into that process, and most importantly, into the lives of people who are trying to navigate our immigration system. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR. I'm Sana, and I'm here every week talking to folks about what they know about the world around us. I hope that you will join me again. And as always, a reminder to subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. Plus, it makes it super easy to share these conversations with other folks who I'm certain are also curious about the world that we live in. Well, I want to close with this reminder. Each and every day, you get to decide. Yes, you get to decide what type of day it's going to be and how you're going to show up in this world. Over time, it is those daily choices that create your life. What type of life are you creating?